Hello everybody, what I wanted to talk about today was an album I revisited for the first time in about like 15 years. Architects, A Sceptic's Universe, record I bought when it came out in the year 2000, and I listened to it so much back then. Back then I was really looking for the most complex technical stuff I can get at my hands on. I was starting to find my own voice as a player, and what I was looking for was just anything I could listen to that would expand my musical vocabulary, something that was just trying to reach different heights, not only in terms of musicianship but in creativity. And back then, at the turn of the century, when technical metal was kind of booming, what was really being pushed was not necessarily the ability, but the creativity. Even in bands that were on like the Unique Leader label, like as few as there were at the turn of the century, they were all very different from each other. Now all the bands on Unique Leader are pretty much interchangeable. When this record came out, A Sceptic's Universe, it was pretty much only discussed about in terms of the technicality on display. And one of the things we've been talking about on this channel is technicality being a good tool to enhance the message of your music if that's what the message is requiring. In this case, I think that a lot of the subtext of the record was overlooked because it really blindsided people when it came out. There wasn't anything that was really this complicated happening in technical, progressive, metal, whatever you want to call it. And people really focused on the conflict that it caused people to have when they listened to it. I think it even came with a warning label on it, not for the faint of heart. And that, of course, drew me to it. And I listened to it profusely. I think that what really made it stand out to me, not necessarily just the technicality, but the sense of melody was very unique to the genre. All the songs were unique to each other. It didn't feel like any of the parts that were on display on this record could have existed in any of the other songs that made the record up. It really felt like it was put together well from start to finish. And I don't see a whole lot of that going on now in what makes up technical metal. Not even just technical death metal, but technical whatever. You think bands that tried to follow suit, your bands like Scale the Summit, still weren't really doing anything that I consider actually progressive, actually technical. People kind of conflate notiness with technicality. And if you can just blindside people with enough notes per riff, you're really kind of just pushing the technicality there. But it really isn't when you start to analyze what's happening with the music. When you start breaking down the fact that there is no rhythmic differentiation between any of the parts. If you're hitting constant 16th notes, or if there isn't a sense of dynamics to the music because they decide to just give you the full-on intensity for the entire record's running time. That's not something that you get with this record. But I vaguely remembered this going into it, and when I reacquainted myself with the record, a lot of what I know the record had to offer was made more readily available to me now that I'm a little bit different in my listening procedure. Back when I first got the record, of course, I was looking for the technicality, the complexness, or the complexity of the record. I was looking for, whatever would really make the record be challenging. I wanted to be challenged. And now I'm looking for good songwriting. And this is something that you're not really going to be finding a whole lot of in technical music. I think a lot of bands that kind of went the technical route, like I don't think Opeth is a particularly technical band. They tried to go the prog route, but you can pinpoint all of their songwriting flaws very easily if you kind of just look at what's going on with their music. They're one of those bands that always had issues with transitions, always had issues tying riffs together. They would end up just ringing out the low E and then going into a completely different passage all the time. This band is one that was always difficult to emulate. There was a side project that happened called Twisted Interform that was pretty solid, put out one record, and it was good, but it wasn't Spiral Architect. This is off the rails progressive, and it does so while still giving you enough hooks and enough memorable melody to give it like the crux of actual substance for a record. It's not alienating, and I'm starting to pick up on now, only so many years after it's been out, that there is a humanness to the record that they were trying to get across. And nowadays, if you want to do technical metal, your goal is to be robotic and not to have any kind of organic aspect to your music. And the very first thing you hear on this record, we're going to look at the song Spinning, which opens the record. The very first thing you hear is a very deep inhale to show that there's going to be an expulsion of something that is innate to a human being. The first thing you hear isn't instrumentation. You hear an actual sound from a human, and I think that kind of grounds the record in this aspect of humanity that modern metal is trying to negate with snapping everything to a grid, pushing the technicality and the dynamics to the point where the music becomes kind of like a wallpaper of sound. That's not what this record is. This record has a lot of dynamics going on, and I think the undercurrent to the record that I'm starting to pick up on now, the genius of the record is it's trying to display the idea of transcendence as indicated on the album cover, and a lot of the imagery that's going on in the music and in the lyrics that I'm picking up on is kind of more grounded in Buddhism, like very basic ideas of trying to transcend the self and realizing that the desire for the journey of transcendence is a dead end, and you end up having this like cyclical nature of starting the idea of going out and looking to find yourself and realizing that is what inhibits you in the process, that you should look inward instead of outward to figure yourself out. And there's a lot of circular imagery that this band uses to kind of get across that idea that when you start a journey, you often end up where you started at the end of it, because you haven't looked for the correct goal when you set out to look for something. And there's not only just a cyclical aspect to the lyrics, but there is in the music, and I'm picking up on that as well. They'll start patterns that have like a descending nature to them in the note choice, and then they'll mirror it with an ascending pattern to have this kind of symmetry that circles have. A lot of that stuff is stuff I wouldn't have noticed when I first listened to it 20 years ago, but it's coming together now. So, rather than just continuing to talk about the record without giving kind of evidence of what's going on, we're going to listen to the first track on the record and see what's going on here, and talk about why this sets itself apart from a lot of the modern technical metal happening now, and why it should have been a stronger benchmark. It should have been a band that people were emulating, but they couldn't figure out how to do it. The one band that surprisingly I think I was hearing some of this influence from was the metalcore band Protest the Hero, which I'm not a fan of, but I was still hearing Spiral Architect and what they were doing. And that is, it's not an easy feat to rip this band off. But what I would have hoped that people would have started to do if they wanted to have this band be an influence is to pick up on the arrangements and what happens when you pair certain riffs with others and how it leads to the greater whole, instead of just picking up on, oh, it's complicated because there's a lot of notes per passage. I think the genius for what this band represents is it tries to get you to understand the basics to nature, but it does so with like heavily ornate music, and it kind of presents that conflict that you will encounter if you're trying to look for a goal that was inward the entire time, but you're affixed on all of the modern trappings in society. I think that that's what the record's greatest success is, and I want to look at the first track right now to pinpoint a lot of what's going on with that musically, and hopefully you guys can see a lot of what I'm seeing in it. So what happened there, I know my dog just barked a lot, so hopefully you could have heard it, but the very first thing that you hear, aside from that inward breathing, is this descending note pattern that's very chaotic, very alienating, very much a sense of conflict. If you hear something like that first time you put on the record, it's going to take you off guard, and it's supposed to. But after repeated listens, you start picking up on what's happening. You realize that it's a few different patterns of descending notes. The counts, the amount of notes per part change, but it's still all descending. And the very next part that you hear after the drums cut out is all ascending notes. So they really want to get that symmetry across to the listener. And I think that there's going to be a lot of that symmetrical aspect coming across later on as the song develops and in the record as a whole. So for a verse riff, there's a lot going on there, but it still has kind of a consistent melody throughout. They do repeat it later to kind of cement it further, but before there was any of that happening where the vocals were over it, you had kind of a chord that had a syncopated rhythm to it, and there is going to be parts in this song that strip down to very basic rhythmic stuff going on that kind of mirrors what's happening more now with modern metal, when they do have those parts where it's just open chugs, you know, here and there, just to intersperse between the majority of their scalar music. This is done so more to ground the song in rhythm, because what you're going to be hearing throughout all of the mutations of the riffs that happen is there's going to be so many scattershot rhythms that it's really difficult to kind of piece the song together unless you've heard it all the countless times that I have. But those parts that break it down to basic rhythm are kind of necessary to provide that human element that they're trying to get across. You know, this is a music about conflict. It's about conflicting the human aspect of your basic needs and wants with the desires that kind of cloud it and make it impossible for you to actually be content. And I think that by having the duality behind some of that, the more basic rhythmic aspects and the symmetrical nature of the melodies that kind of ground the music, you really have a full palette of what the ups and downs of a journey can provide. So there's a lot more going on, a lot more multidimensional stuff going on just in the opening, 30 seconds of this record than what you'll hear in a lot of music that's happening today. But let's keep going with it. So they go back to that ascending part that I mentioned earlier, that has a mirrored nature to the very beginning of the record that has all those really quick descending patterns. And then they go back into what I guess you can consider a verse riff, which is really a very complex series of rhythms and melodies. So despite all of the chaos that's happening, they're still focusing on structure to keep the song grounded. So they brought back the idea of a basic bare bones rhythm, which allowed the vocals to kind of take center stage more, and become the focus of the song for just a little bit. When you have a vocalist as talented, you want to give them a little bit of room to breathe, and I don't think that they've ever, in the course of this record, sacrificed the musical arrangements to allow the vocals to kind of take center stage, but I think they wanted like a tribal kind of like marchy feel for this part to like kind of grind into the listener what the main aspects of the vocals are trying to say here, the message of the song, and how there is a conflict going on with the speaker. So if you were to follow along with the lyrics, you would see that you are getting that conflict. The same kind of conflict that the speaker is encountering is the same kind of conflict that we are going to be getting as listeners when encountering this kind of music that's overly alienating at first, but kind of peels the layers back on repeated listens. So a lot of that palm muted, like higher or middle range notey stuff, it was kind of like a more of a deviation on what was happening during the verse riff, but it was much less scattershot, much more consistent in terms of rhythm, and they were using that to bridge towards more of an instrumental passage in the song, but still what was carrying it and what was making it less piecemeal in terms of arrangement was that tonally it still was consistent with the rest of the song. You weren't hearing a massive dynamic shift in terms of like how the intervals between the song worked, whether or not you were getting that immense conflict in light and dark. You weren't really getting that. You're still getting the build, the natural ebb and flow of passages here, but it's not jumping all across the board. And they strip it back a little bit even further here. So you do get, scales happening in that solo, but you also have iconic phrases happening in it. You don't have just simple runs. You have notes that have more value when compared to other notes in the passage. You have notes that are held out longer. When you're trying to give meaning to the riffs that you're coming up with, you assign note values, and a lot of what's happening in modern music today, all of the notes have equal value because they are all consistent with the same rhythmic patterns. You're hearing consistent 16th notes. You're not hearing the importance of whether or not one note is going to make the next note have more value to it in reference. And that's one of the things that I really miss hearing in music. I want to hear that riff B matters because of what riff A did, and I want to hear that note 4 matters because of what note 3 did. There's a lot more going on in display here in terms of mental preparation of the song. It really isn't just about being flashy. There's a lot more going on here in terms of giving value to the overall song by giving value to the parts that make it up. So the rhythmic part that they're going into here is actually kind of more of a truncated version of what they did before when they stripped it down and went to open chugs before. It was a note, the pattern I think was sets of 4 followed by sets of 3. Now we're getting sets of 2 followed by sets of 3. So they're trying to showcase a dynamic difference here. And what happens when you have shorter phrases like that? What happens when you have that more of a stutter than a gallop? You're providing a difference in rhythm, which gives you a different coloring mentally. It gives you a different emotional appeal. And I think that further lends to the symmetry of the band, the symmetry of the music, how they presented you with something that flowed more rhythmically in terms of having 4 notes in your open chug pattern to this really disjointed 2-note pattern. So why is the song presenting itself that way later on? We don't have much left in the song, but why is, when the song peels back to the point where you're getting just raw rhythm, why is it presenting itself this way? I think that they're trying to show you that the conflict of the music is getting to the point where the appeal to human nature is getting stripped away even further. That kind of rhythm, that stuttering of the 2-note passages it's a lot less natural than the 4-note pattern that we encountered before. That's something that is a little bit more familiar to us as listeners. So by making the song seem more foreign later on in the passage of the music, you're seeing that the band is trying to give you the idea that the conflict is more than the speaker had intended going into it, that there is going to be less of a chance of catharsis here. The music is not going to resolve the way that we want it to, but it's going to resolve the way that they want it to. So let's see how they close out the song. So they repeat the very first thing you hear in the song, but they do it for 2 phrases instead of 1. So they want you to remember what happened in the beginning of the song, but it immediately followed one of the more disjointed phrases that you're going to hear. So they want you to have that sense of familiarity, but to know that you are not on stable ground yet. And I think that that's very effective at presenting that conflict that music can give you even further. And this whole passage was the one that I mentioned before. That is a more stripped down version of what you were hearing during that crazy sounding verse, but I believe it's in a different key now. So when you take a passage that is part of a song and you present it later on in a different key, you're giving it a different color while still keeping it tonally consistent, and that is a successful way of showing that there's a change to your music while still having the familiar aspects of the melody be intact. It's showing that you know how to develop a song without introducing new themes that don't necessarily belong. And that's also something you don't get out of a lot of modern music. When they want to show the idea of progression, they usually bombard you with theme after theme because they want you to be put under the guise that they have a sense of progressiveness to them, when they really are just grasping at straws to try to piece together any kind of semblance of structure. And that was the second passage of the song, returning to kind of give the song more of a grounded feel, because the very first time you hear that, there's no other instrumentation other than the guitar. It's accompanied later on by the rest of the instrumentation, but they wanted this particular melody to be what is going to be one of the focal points of the song, something that you're going to remember. By playing it again at the end of the song to try to tie it together, you're getting it's already been assigned a different meaning by having the riffs that precede it, and you're able to gain interpretation of what the song is trying to do, rather than just have your basic verse chorus type of arrangement, or having an arrangement that has no tie-in to the parts whatsoever. This is what you need to take into account when you're trying to analyze songwriting, is when they do bring together parts, when they do reintroduce parts, or when they don't reintroduce parts, what is the reasoning for it? And I know that the nature of this music, being rooted in conflict, is throwing bones at the listener to try to get them to remember the parts that ground the song, but still have there be elements of progression to each part when it returns, so that it has a slightly different color to showcase that music and experience is one that is subject to change. You're not going to encounter, especially if you're going on any kind of journey, whether it's of the self or to find any kind of external goal. It's going to be not a static idea. You're going to be encountering things that may seem familiar to you, but are going to be different when you process them. And I think that that's what they're trying to do when they bring back themes in slightly different ways. So that's the kind of phrase that you would normally associate with the build to a climax. And by cutting out and ending right there, you're kind of robbing the audience of the climax that they're looking forward to. But there's such an appropriate build towards the end that you don't really necessarily need the kind of catharsis that an entirely new theme would provide. It's kind of like, it reminds me of like No Country for Old Men. You don't get the major gunfight you're looking forward to, but you realize that the development of the characters is what drives the main goal of the movie, and the main goal of this song is how is it manipulating the listener? It's forcing you to encounter a very aggressive style in terms of what it's presenting to you orally. It's making you feel on edge. It's very complicated music. I've heard it enough times where it doesn't sound nearly as complicated as it did when I first heard it in 2000, but it's still, I could tell that there's still a lot of complexity to this music. And I've always railed on the idea of complexity being the focus of your arrangement. And I think people that encountered this record when it came out, I think that they gave it the wrong criticism. I really think that by focusing on the technical aspect of the music, you're kind of negating what the goal of the music actually was, and that was to give the listener a sense of conflict, but also provide them the means to kind of decode what is happening by having such a strong sense of melody, by having parts that are kind of iconic after repeated listening. It's one of those things where there is a very simple underlying undercurrent to this music, but you have to wade through all the ornate aspects to get there. And I think that is the goal of the philosophy of the band. You can tell that based on the imagery, based on the arrangements, that they want to present you with something that is superficially almost impenetrable. But when you break it down and realize that that conflict is the crux of the music itself, you understand that by going out and trying to decode what they're doing, you're kind of missing the point of the music. And I really think that was the underlying goal of this band. I think that's something that we didn't understand back then. This came out during the big technicality boom of the late 90s, turn of the century rather, and we were too focused on the technique to really ascertain the actual goal of what the music was doing. And that's why people have been clamoring for a new Spiral Architect record. It's been 21 years. People still want to hear what this band can do, because I can't think of a band that has come across since this that has presented the nature of conflict so well and provided us with music that is both really, really complex yet still timeless, because it has that duality of the aspect of humanity being mired in not being able to understand the logistics of an evolving world around them. But there is a reward for understanding that that journey of trying to decipher it is really what is going to prevent you from fully understanding yourself in the process. There's not a whole lot of bands that are getting that idea across. Right now, the idea is to bewilder the listener, kind of try to get the idea across that you're getting technicality to be present in your music, but doing so to make yourself seem less and less human, to the point where it is robotic. And when music loses that element of humanity to it, you really don't have anything to relate to. You are just looking at a series of essentially data. And data is something that you can look at and admire, but it's nothing that you're going to actually identify with or relate to. And that is why modern music just doesn't have the timeless quality to it that this band does. So thanks for listening, and I will catch you guys next week.